My name is Charles Lakes. I am a first year Microsoft Biz Apps MVP for Power Apps. Similar to Ed, I also enjoy Power Automate, which is why Power Automate is our talk for today. And one of the reasons I really enjoy Power Automate is it becomes the kind of glue or the automation tool connecting everything for the Power Platform. My forte, I do a lot of talks with Canvas apps, and I do a lot with Dataverse. And regardless of how good or how scalable I can build a business application, Power Automate is really helpful inside of the Power Apps, Power Automate, and Power Platform space as a whole of being able to just extend the functionality of all the applications. So even though I am Power Apps, I really enjoy Power Automate as well. But for today's talk, I did want to look at Power Automate from three different facets. First and foremost, when you look at the Power Platform, it's meant for the non-traditional devs. I am a pro dev, so I have a background in software engineering. So I'm able to identify a lot of things inside the Power Platform that I think are the foundational principles that have been abstracted away from a pro code space. And I think when you understand that even as a pro dev coming into the low code space or just a pro dev business non-traditional person coming in, when you understand those foundational principles, you can grow your automations by leaps and bounds. So I wanted to share some of the things that I personally do to make my flows just more performant and a little snazzy from time to time. So with that, just very quick, a little bit about myself. Again, as I mentioned, my background is pro code. I have a background in software engineering. I have done a lot of stuff in the SharePoint space. So I've done web portals. I've also done some desktop applications, and I'm working on a couple of mobile apps right now. So there's still a lot of pro code work I do. Just last few days, I've been working with the Graph API using PowerShell. So I do a lot in the pro code space, but I think 2018, 2019, I stumbled across Power Automate, Power Apps, and Power BI, and started doing a lot more in the low code space. So I kind of toggle between the two of being a pro code developer versus a low code maker, because when you understand what, at least my personal belief, when you look at a lot of what your user requirements are, they don't always require like a full pro code initiative to get up and running. Sometimes they may just need a simple form, just something to do like a couple branch logic. And so low code is able to address a lot of those type of use cases. And I started doing business consulting for business solutions to help people better understand what type of solutions they're really looking for. Based off your requirements, do you really need a pro code solution, or can you get away with something with a low code space? And then you also have the idea that some things could be achieved with no code. So I kind of help people toggle between the three of pro code, low code, and no code. And I always like to put down the gauntlet as well when I introduce myself, is that I am also a middle child, and I believe that we are the greatest of the children. So that is a bit about myself. Cover pro code background, I'm a low code maker, business solution consultant, and a middle child. In jumping into our agenda, I'm essentially going to talk about the Power Automate from four different aspects. How can we make the flows scalable? How can we make our flows more reliable, readable, and extensible? The scalability and extensibility might seem very closely related, but I'm going to differentiate them a little different of looking at scalability as being able to take a solution and allow it to be growing in its scope. Does it need to be deployed in more locations? Does it need to grow to address more of an audience? Does it need to address more people being the user base and so forth? Extensibility, I'm going to look at more of being able to process larger volumes of data. You could look at this where a lot of people build solutions for themselves first. Then they may build something for their respective team and then the department. And as you're growing from yourself to your team to the department to maybe something for the entire enterprise, you are going to be consuming larger and larger amounts of data. And oftentimes those flows that would have run in 30 seconds when it's just you and your team could start taking minutes, if not hours, to run if they're designed poorly. So those are going to be the four: scalability, reliability, readability, and extensibility for your cloud flows. And we're going to have a demo as I show some examples of these. But before we jump into the demo, I do want to kind of highlight the pieces so that once we go through the demo, you'll start connecting the dots. So we get it to move forward. All right, there we go. So the first part, when we're looking at extensibility, I think these are three things that if you are not already doing, I think are the intro level to working toward making your solutions able to grow beyond just yourself and being able to kind of be a little more custom. In the pro code space, when we build a solution, we'll oftentimes have a configuration file. The config file is going to point to whether it's our local host, if it's going to point to a connection string for our dev environment, our UAT, our testing, or production. Because ideally, you should never build in the same solution you're having your end users work in. So we have something called application lifecycle management. What that means is that I can build in my dev environment. I can break as much stuff as I want and not impact any other environments. So you think about maybe your favorite apps on your phone. If you're working on the LinkedIn app, they're never really making the changes in production. Someone has a dev space. They work in dev space. They introduce the changes. They push that to a quality check space. Once they get a thumbs up from maybe their quality assurance team, then they're able to go to production where we as the consumers are able to see the updates. Solutions inside the Power Platform allow us to do the same thing with our cloud flows. So we all know we get the default environment when we are licensing our users, but you should never really build for the enterprise in the default environment. You should have a separate environment for your dev, at least one more for QA, and then one for production. Solutions are the easy way of putting your flows inside of a box. So when you're ready to move from one environment to another, you can take all your toys with you. Every project asset goes into the solution. One of those project assets could be environment variables as well as the connection references. The environment variables are able to be specified per environment based off their name. So I'll have an environment variable that's just a simple string. The string will say, when I'm in my dev environment, is DEV. So my flow knows only do X, Y, and Z while I'm in dev, and then I'll change it to PROD for prod. And that's a simple example of working with an environment variable. The connection reference is great because when I move to the next environment, it should not be using my credentials, because the last thing we want is to have an enterprise level solution running for the entire organization. And then I decide I want to change my logins and it breaks something. So ideally, connection references are ideal to work for a service account so that it doesn't have to be tied to a single person. So that's going to be the part for extensibility. When we talk about reliability, if you have not already, there is error handling inside the Power Platform, and more specifically inside of Power Automate as you're working with what happens after each action. We know a workflow is essentially going to be a single trigger with a sequence of actions. The problem, though, is that Power Automate assumes every action is going to be successful. So is successful is the default action to be handled by everything happening for all subsequent actions. But you do have the ability of saying, what if this is not going to be successful? There's a timeout. What should happen if this is timing out? Which is something to consider if you're having a larger volume of data. If I'm working on a solution that only has 500 records, it's very unlikely it's going to time out. However, I have a solution I'm working on at work where there's tens and hundreds of thousands of records. Time to process that is very likely there will be a timeout. So I need to adjust if there's going to be a timeout or if there's just a simple failure. So we're going to talk about the error handling, because when you're making it reliable, being able to handle and not crash and burn the second something doesn't come through as expected is going to make your solutions and your flows production ready. Then the third part, readability. The running joke of all programmers is that we suck at documentation. And it's kind of weird to call it a running joke because it's kind of true. We do suck with documentation. But with Power Automate, because it's the visual editor for workflow, it is largely kind of intuitive to read through what's happening. However, there's still things you can do like add notes to your actions, use scope controls. I'll show you how I actually choose to rename some of my actions to give it a bit of a documentation. And there's actually some convenient ways of using compose actions if you haven't done so. Compose is great when you're wanting to do something more complex outside of a generic array, object, integer, or string. You can do a lot more. So I'll show you how I've been using compose actions for more complex logic. And then the last piece before we start jumping into the demo is the idea of scalability. I talked about solutions being a great way of bundling all your project assets inside of a box. You also get the benefit of creating what we call a child flow when you have it inside of a solution. And the child flow is great for the primary reason being able to centralize some content. Another thing about developers is that we don't like having to repeat ourselves when we're doing our code. So if I had to write a function, I don't want to have to rewrite that same piece of logic over and over and over again. Because when I need to make a change, I now have to update every single time I made that piece of code reference, I have to update it. Child flows allow us to centralize that core logic. Any logic that needs to be duplicated, I can centralize into a single cloud flow and have the other flows simply call it and return the result whenever it needs to be done. An example of this could be, I have a project where, let's say we have the opportunity table inside of Dynamics 365. If an opportunity is created, I want to trigger on a brand new opportunity. I also want to trigger when the opportunity is modified. I can have a single trigger for each of those flows, and then a third flow that has all of the woodworkings that needs to be done with whatever needs to happen, the target system, simply as a call away from those. So I'll show that, as well as filter arrays are going to be performance boosts. If you know how to use arrays as well, I will oftentimes use arrays to hold my error messages inside my flow, as well as just a quick performance boost for a switch control in contrast to if-then logic. So those are going to be the four things we talked about as I show the demo. We're going to show some examples of extending the flow, making it reliable, making it readable, and making it scalable. So with that, let me jump into this other screen here. And because I can't see the chat, just real quick, Ed, is there anything in the chat so far?
Nothing so far, man. You're good.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. So the example I'm going to use here is going to be a SharePoint document library. So I have a document library where I've created just a bunch of dummy content. There is a bunch of Access database files, Word documents, text files, zip files, and so forth. So there is exactly 120 because it was just copy and paste. So this is what I'm going to use for my examples. Coming into Power Automate, and this would be if you have not already done so, I typically start my solutions from Power Automate. That's probably just because I'm in the Power App space inside the Dataverse. You can do this inside of Power Automate as well, but I typically go to Power Apps. And just kind of showing how this is, if you're inside of Power Apps, come down to Solutions. If Solutions is not already tagged here, you always have the More option, and you can make sure Solutions is pinned. So you come into Solutions, you can create a new solution, and this is where you're able to create a name for your solution as well as select a publisher. If you don't already have yourself as a publisher, you can always add yourself, and then that is just a quick way with your team being able to identify who is the person working on this solution. So I am going to go into an existing solution that I was tinkering with. So I have one here called Demo Power Automate. So this is an example of looking at my project assets being bundled together. So I have 4 different cloud flows. I have several connection references, and then I have several environment variables. And the good thing about the solution is that I can actually create more project assets. If I come up along the top, I can create Dataverse tables. I can create security roles, as well as just component libraries, choices, and so forth. And as all these are put together, if I come back up to the top here, and let's say I need to move this into another space. As I mentioned, application lifecycle management, we can set up pipelines, but we can also, if we want to just for testing, simply say export solution, and this creates a zip file of our entire solution that we can move from our dev space to our QA space, do some checking, and then we can move it on to our production space. I will give the recommendation, if you have not already done this, this is an option to do deployment processes for pipelines. But I do want to point out, when you're publishing your solutions here, you're going to be presented with two options. You're going to have the option of doing something that is managed or unmanaged. And the difference is going to be that if it is unmanaged, when you move it to the next environment, all the project assets could be modified. That is ideal if you're going to be moving to another dev space, or let's say I wanted to share what I built with Brent and let Brent build from there. So that is ideal when you're building something. If you are trying to do something for application lifecycle management, where you're wanting to build in dev and make sure that what you're building in production can't be modified, this is not the ideal approach. You should be doing managed solutions when you move to upper tiers. And this is taking much longer than expected, so I'm just going to dive into the demo. So as I mentioned, we have a number of different assets here. And my favorite I tend to do is going to be the connection references. So I will oftentimes create connection references for whatever solutions I need to work with. So I have connection reference to Dataverse, SharePoint, Outlook, and that is as simple as coming down to more and being able to create a reference to this so that when I move it to the next environment, we know for sure these are the data sources. These are the resources that my solution will need to work with, so that whomever, whether or not is myself, infrastructure engineer, an IT admin, whoever is going to help with that migration from my environment to the next environment, they're able to simply just do a plug and play. They're taking the zip file, they're going to be prompted for what type of connection it should be, and they can provide their credentials. And we can do a connection reference to pretty much every connector that's going to be here. Coming down to environment variables, these are good for where you're able to use anything that's a variable, because one of the things that's also a taboo as you start doing more and more development as a pro code dev, never hard code anything. I have seen plenty of solutions where people hard code things, and then when they're having to then scale it for a larger audience, there's the concern that passwords are going to be exposed. The connection string is visible to everybody because they chose to put a connection string in something that was unsecure. But here we're able to use environment variables that when we move it to the next environment, whether or not I move this from dev to QAT or to test or prod, I'm going to be prompted for each one what should be the new variable. I could choose to include some of these to follow along. So if I click on email subject, the email should say error Power Automate Cloudflow. I can specify this as the default value or provide a value that's only going to be accessible to this environment. And this is going to be important to keep in mind as well, is if you provide a default value that can travel with the environment variable, regardless of how many environments you put it to. If you keep this blank and you only have something available here inside the current value is just going to be for that instance. So that allows you to keep that walled garden of your respective environments. Just going to discard this change. And jumping into the flows, I did want to show how I was building flows when I first stumbled across Power Automate. So I'm going to show, this is my cloud flow that's for my newbie when I did this a couple years ago, and then more so what I get into now. And so if I actually open this here, I'm going to open another tab just in case the Wi-Fi isn't the most stable. And while this is coming up, I'm also going to expand all the actions so you can kind of see what I'm working on. And this looks like what I've done, as well as a composite of what I've seen other people do when they're building their first flows. And the thing I want to point out, I guess, is that it's great to create the flows and create the variables. And I have a variable for an object, I have a variable for strings, numbers, but whenever you create a new variable, so I come here, I've chosen to pin variable as a shortcut, and I say I want to initialize another variable. All this simply does is append the number because they're just copies. And this has been very tricky as a pro code dev trying to go in and kind of mentor some of the starting makers. So what I recommend is if you're going to call a flow variable, we'll call this one demo var. We're going to make this an object. I will sometimes actually rename the action. So I'll keep it so we know that it's initializing a variable, but I'll simply say initialize demo var. So that way, when I'm looking at the top level, I can see what the flow variables should be without having to select and go into each one. And so this helps with the readability of your flows. So that even as I'm going at a glance, I can kind of see what's happening. And this is good to kind of keep your naming convention very consistent so that it carries down. I also do sometimes where if I am coming into a loop here, so this is going to loop through the SharePoint document library that we showed here. We have the document library with, I believe, probably about 1,000 records, 1024. I try to keep it close to binary. So we're going to loop through this, and it's going to take a while because for each instance, I want to loop through each one, store the current item inside the object, and then within the object, I want to do a parsing. And this is something I do as well. Could be helpful for everyone. This is essentially a hash table, what we would call it inside the C languages. This is going to be an object which is represented by JSON. So let me actually open an item. If you have not looked at the JSON of an export prior, you're able to essentially take the object and you have what we call a key value pair. So we have key value pairs for the response here. So we come here, look at the output. So everything basically becomes a key value pair. To return the author claims, we simply have to use this to pull back any value we may want. Apologies. So this is going to be the key value pair of getting the name of the file with file extension. And then I'm going to use the idea of splitting the array. And if you haven't done arrays and splits, you can actually use a delimiter. So in this case, I'm using the dot because we know every file extension is dot something, whether or not it's dot docx, dot txt, dot pptx. So I'm going to split this and get the last instance of that to return the actual name, the full extension. So that's what we're going to do here. So we store it inside of an object, which is something I do in a lot of my flows. I recommend people do as well, because I don't want to share how we came across this, but it was a painful learning lesson the first time this came across. The reason I oftentimes do the temp object where I initialize at the top, and then inside the flow, I assign the current item here, is I've seen people simply reference the actual file, the fields from this. So if we scroll down, we see from this action of get files property, they'll sometimes just return this. The problem here, and why I use a variable instead as a placeholder, is that sometimes they've had to replace this as the input here with something that has the exact same properties. However, if you remove this, it then breaks every instance you want it to if you use the field directly. If you do this and you have this stored as an object, and then you're parsing the object, all you have to do is make sure that the input is going to be consistent for the naming, and it allows you to use those without breaking your flow. The particular instance I was working on with a fellow maker, I believe there were 20 or 30 fields, and that was done 3 times inside his flow. So when he changed his data source from a different SharePoint list or a different external source, he then had to remap every single one of those, versus being able to store it inside of a variable and then to just make sure this one variable has the correct object type. So that would be the first tip here of looking for some efficiencies of using variables. I also want to share, this is, I've seen people do this as well. I would say from a Proco dev, this becomes wasteful it's not like you're going to get multiple seconds per each of these conditions, but this becomes wasted resources because I am wanting to count, is this a TXT file? If so, give me a total count of 1. I'm going to increment by 1. Increment by 1 if this is going to be an Excel file. And this works, but it becomes inefficient. Something that could be done instead would be to nest these. And what this does is it only has to do the calculation once for each of these. If it is what's the first one again? If it's a text file, we don't have to worry about wasting resources and time checking these other options because we know it's a text file. And so this becomes a slightly performance boost being able to nest it. I will say though, Power Automate has a nesting limit of 8 levels, I believe. So you can only go down so far. But if you're only doing 3 or 4 levels, this is a nice boost we will do inside of a pro code space of being able to essentially turn this into if, else, if, then an else. And I would say conversely, something else, if you have not done switches is another benefit of being able to do something a little bit faster. So what you can do here is instead of every single one of these having to be a condition, is it this type of extension? Is it this extension? Is it this extension? What a switch does is actually speed this up a little bit, where what we're able to do, apologies that zoomed in, let me actually zoom it out, is inside the switch, you provide what needs to be compared across everything. So instead of using this variable of temp extension and checking it 15, 20 times, you provide it one time and you simply just provide what you're looking for here for if it equals this, then we proceed. And I've seen some performance boosts. If you're doing 1 or 2 records, 1 or 2 loops, it's not going to be a huge boost. However, once you start getting to the enterprise level that we're talking about, and you have thousands of records, going from nested ifs to something like a switch statement could save you seconds per iteration, depending on how much logic you're doing. And with Power Automate, this is actually built on top of something called Azure Logic Apps. And that's when you really start getting those benefit boosts, because when you look at this being built on top of Microsoft Azure, Azure is a consumption service. So the longer you're using the resources, that's what you're really paying for. Power Automate, luckily, we kind of get away with a little bit because essentially what you're being charged with Power Automate is the run. But once you start getting to the enterprise, you also care about if it runs, but also how long is it running. And this, as I mentioned, with larger flows, could save you seconds, which can add up as you start having hundreds or thousands of flows running each month. And I believe that's the last one for the newbie. So I did want to show for the newbie, I recommend renaming your initialized variables to include the variable name so that you can easily read what's going to be here. If you have to do if conditions, you can nest them to save a little bit of performance, but the biggest performance boost if it's going to be a little bit slower than if you do a switch control. So I'll show you those. And now I'll show you kind of how this can grow into something greater. So let me jump into my advanced flow. And actually, before I jump into advanced flow, I did want to show, let me close this. With the newbie flow, I was able to do as well as an example is show you the run history. So I did some runs yesterday. I did some runs a little while before here. You see this takes about 2 minutes, 3 seconds, 3 minutes, 3 seconds, a minute, 23. So it's not the slowest thing I could have built, but the fact that each flow is taking almost a minute, 2 minutes every single time can be problematic considering that I'm only looking at 1,000 records. So to loop 1,000 records is taking more than 60 to 90 seconds. Comparing that to what I do for my advanced flow, if I scroll down, my longest run for my advanced flow is 5 seconds, because all I'm doing here in the first one is saying, I want to count 4 different file types. Tell me how many text files I have. Tell me how many Word documents, how many Excel files, and how many PowerPoint files. And the flow is simply just iterating through each one. And if it matches a file extension, it's going to increment by 1 to give me a full count. And that's how I would have done this 3, 4, 5 years ago. And you see it takes roughly 2 to 3 minutes to iterate 1,000 records. To get the counts faster, again, 5 seconds, 3 seconds, I can actually run this again. It can still just be 3 seconds. So to show you some of the benefits I did here to get you that speed that would be better for once you grow past your team and you need to be able to process larger volumes of data for your enterprise. The first thing I do is expand these. I highly recommend looking into, if you haven't already, the filter array. Filter array is found here. So we say add an action. Under data operation, you can come into data operations. You have an action here called filter array. So when I come to SharePoint and say, give me all the files from this document library, and you see I'm returning all 1,024 of them, I want to return all of these, and it's going to return me an array of all those items. What I want to do is, instead of iterating through the entire thing, and this is a way of slicing your data set and getting you a performance boost. So I'm able to say, give me this array as an input, and I want to filter it using the file extension. We saw in the newbie flow, what I would have done is for each one, I would have just simply stored what the extension was and did an increment count every time I found one. Here, I say, I want to use that input array. I want to look for the file extension as the parameter, and I want to see any file that has, it ends with .pptx. And this is an example also of me using the add notes. So if you come up here to the 3 dots, there's a command to say add note. I already have a note, so the option would be to delete. When you're doing formulas like this, I highly recommend you doing a note just so you can remind yourself, as well as whoever might need to work after you, what this was. Because you'll see sometimes I can hover over it and Power Automate will tell me what it is. I did item, I did brackets, file name with extension under curly brackets. But if I click on it, I can't actually change it. So Power Automate will sometimes reformat what I've done. And so if I need to change it again, I can actually just clear this, go into the formula, and paste this back in. And having this as a note is a good reminder, because what if I had mistyped something? Instead of having to retype the whole thing, I can just copy and paste and make the correction and simply add it back. But you see, it changes it again. So having it here is a good way of referencing if I ever need to make changes. But I was able to simply say, filter on the PowerPoint, filter on the Excel file. I do the same for Word and text. And this performed not even twice as fast, because if we go from my fastest run for my newbie flow was 39 seconds. Even 39 seconds is several times slower than this going 5 seconds. And this is with it doing more actions. So showing you a bit more here. Let me actually scroll up a bit. I did want to also share scope controls is something else I believe that a lot of people should start looking into, because when you're looking at being able to look at your flow as a whole, I've done some very long flows in the last several years. I've been working Power Automate, and it's always interesting to open a flow and have a long running list and having to zoom out to see everything. So I started using scope controls to collapse things down to make my flows easier to just look at a glance. And then even my scope controls, I can rename these like I did my variables to explain what's happening. I can always add notes to the scope controls as well to give it more context. But for this one, it's pretty simple. I want to have a get SharePoint files. So I have a scope control to list everything. And this is where I start getting to the first level of error handling. Because I can do scope controls to just combine and consolidate everything, I can actually do scope controls as well to help me move my error handling and combine all the actions that need to happen. So I have, and I will sometimes, this is not a recommendation, I could be a suggestion. You can take from it what you will. What I often do for simplicity, whatever I'm calling the parent scope control, in this case, get SPO files, I will use one for error, and I'll create one for success. So what do I need to happen from this that is going to fail? Here, I want to use an array, and I want to say what happened. And this, if it is successful, then I'm going to do these actions. And this is if it fails in any capacity. So if I say from here, I need to get these files, I'm getting all 1024. I want to then come to this scope control, select the scope control, and this is the error handling. You select settings, and you have default actions. As I mentioned, a lot of actions by default would say is successful, but I'm expecting this to fail. So if I actually scroll this over, this is how I get this branch logic. If anything goes wrong with get files, whether it's a timeout or something is failing, I want to notify the developer, in this case myself, that there's a problem. So I want to say, hey, there was a problem at the get SharePoint files properties only action. So that's my notification. But you may be noticing here, I'm not sending the email directly. I'm not sending email directly because there might be further issues of something happening. And if I scroll down, there's other possibilities. There could be an issue with filtering for any of these. So I do the same thing. I have an array, and this is another thing that I do share with people that I found helpful. I made a mistake, and I learned this lesson very quickly. I made a mistake where there was a series of actions in a flow that was going to scale for a larger audience. And every time there's a pain point that could fail, I had it send me an email. Once it scaled up where it started generating more and more flow runs, that also resulted in more errors because people were entering things incorrectly. And my inbox got filled up in a couple hours with a few thousand emails. So I created a rule until I can solve it, to put it into another folder. But that's why I started using the arrays. So what I do is, instead of sending an email, I could also, and I do recommend this to some people as well, you could also just write this to a Dataverse table as like an error log table. And that could be something to centralize what your action should be in. But if you aren't ready to jump into Dataverse, or you don't have a database system to track those logs, and you prefer to receive emails, I think this is a good alternative to sending an email for every single error message. Instead, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 different places where this can fail. So as the flow runs, instead of me getting 5 emails for every execution, potentially, I'm taking an array variable, which I initialize at the very top here. Let me actually go back up here. So this is all I do. I've created an array with a very creative name called array of errors. And for every time there's an instance of an error message, I can give a custom message to it. And so then at the very bottom, I can scroll down and I have an action here that if for my error array, I'm going to check the length. So we want to make sure it's not 0, because we should not be sending an email regardless of all the time. So I'm going to say if the length of this array is not 0, if it's not equal to 0, I would then like to send an email. And so the email is going to be me using a compose action. And this is where I mentioned compose being for more complex types of data. Variables is strictly going to be Boolean, object, array, integer, string, float, and so forth. If you use a compose action, you can actually do anything in here. You can use XML, HTML, you can do more complex JSON notation, and so forth. I chose to do some very simple HTML because I can do web design as well. So I do use a header. So it's gonna be big text, something bad happened. That's never good to hear. And I'm going to create a bulleted list that will just take the array and combine it to create a bullet list of every single error message. So if this flow runs, this is the performance of not filling up and overwhelming myself as the developer with emails. Instead of potentially 5 error messages per flow run, and there's 1,000 runs, so instead of getting 5,000 emails, I could just have this combine the errors of that one run into an email. So I go from 5,000 potential emails down to just 1,000. Still not ideal. We want to get close to 0, but that is a considerable decline from like not being able to even overwhelm our Exchange server, having to generate 4,000 emails. I will say though, when you add this to your body, do make sure you toggle here, which is going to go from your single text to being able to do the HTML, the code view. And then from the code view, you can simply add the output of this compose action because it is HTML. But while I have this here, this is the example I talked about with the environment variables. So you see I have environment variable here for emailing to. Who is the developer that needs to be notified? Instead of hard coding their email address to send it to charles@email.com, I use an environment variable, which is inside my solution. If I go back to here, so I have email to and email subject. Those become accessible inside of my Cloudflow so that even if I were to go back to emailing myself for each single action, I don't have to hard code each variable. I can still use a flow variable and then put this environment variable inside of it. It still becomes an easy way of being able to quickly replace a value if I need to scale up. Because emailing me might be fine for now, but let's say you move on to another big project. So they need to do hypercare because you're moving to a bigger solution and this is going to be something for the enterprise. You don't likely want this going to a single maker or a single person. So there might be a distribution list. Having this as an environment variable in one environment, once it goes to the next one, they can just put in the email address for that distribution list. Or you can just put in an email address to support, which is something else that is possible. If this is the mission critical Power Automate flow, instead of emailing a person and then waiting for the person to get assigned to it, you could have that variable assigned to email whatever your support platform may be, whether or not it's Top Desk or any other solution, you have it emailing that directly. I did want to also mention something that I've done with Compose, which is being kind of creative. This isn't my favorite use case of it, but I want to count the number of files found for Word documents, text files, and so forth. If it's not 0, notify me. If it is 0, don't worry about it because nothing was found. So what I'm going to show is, if I scroll down here, I have another one. I've created compose actions to do simple JSON formatting. And this is a very rudimentary example, but I'm giving an example of just very basic. I have a JSON object, how many PowerPoints, Word, Excel, and text files I have, all zeros. Then I create another compose action with the same format, but these are going to give me the lengths of the array for the respective filters. And this is another reason why it's good to rename your actions above as well. Rename your actions is good for someone being able to just read and skim. But as you get to further actions down below, and you want to use this dynamic content, having them renamed to be something more descriptive allows you to easily find them when you're scrolling through your dynamic content. Because if this simply just said filter array 1, 2, and 3, I would not know which one was for text, doc, X, and so forth. So that's another reason why it's important to rename your actions as you're building for something more outside of your own personal usage. But coming back to here, the benefit of being able to do this, again, this is a very rudimentary example. I came up with this originally because I was syncing an external system with SharePoint. And the data points that need to come over to SharePoint, there were roughly 32, 34 data points, I believe. So instead of coming into a condition and having to map each and every single value and have 32, 34 different conditions, I created 2 JSON objects, had whatever I'm expecting be the current state, and I have a second JSON object, which is the actual state. And all my condition now does is compare the 2 objects. So instead of comparing 32 individual objects on 32 different data points, I put the data points into 2 objects and just compare the JSONs. And that becomes something that's easier because this is cleaner for people to read and it's more manageable than seeing a list of 32 conditions here. And showing how that email would look, because I just embed inside of the email. This is an example of something running from earlier. So again, it got the counts as expected. And even if we were to run this for a test, just to prove that the performance is as fast as it appears to be. I'm going to publish and test this. And I think what's funny about this is that with the internet lagging just a moment, the time it will take to run, it will actually be done by now. So it's running. I'm the owner. Hit run. Oh, like it actually wanted to show and run a little bit longer, so 9 seconds. But they're still faster than what we showed with the newbie flow, being able to iterate all the records. This ran in 9 seconds flat, running through everything. And we're able to do that because of, instead of looking at every single record and doing an incremental count, we're able to do these filters and then just get the length of each of these arrays. And we can do this as many times as possible because I have 4 of these. And these are also going to do the same type of branching to see if there is going to be a problem. Fortunately, there was no issue, but we're able to do the branching if necessary. And scrolling down. So the branching helps with the reliability because we're doing the proper error handling. The filters are great because they're a performance boost. The JSON objects here also become nice for readability as well as maintainability, because if you have more and more records, it's easy enough to just create another object for these. And I've done this where I've had 4 objects. I can actually do this first comparison and then create a second pairing and do that second comparison. This is actually helpful as well in a third scenario I worked on, where if you do a lot with SharePoint, you know SharePoint does version history. Every single file, every single item has a version history. There's actually an action in here. I'm not going to build the flow. I just want to show that this is available. So we come up here and say see more for SharePoint. We have, I think it's usually around the middle. So we have a lot of actions. We have an action here for, here you go, get changes. So get changes for a file or an item. This is good because you can actually use the same connection references, and we'll do this here, an example of entering current value. This is another reason why it's beneficial to use the connection reference, because let's say I wasn't sure which site it would have been in my list of sites, because as an admin, I'm a member of, or I have access to, I should say, I have access to a number of SharePoint sites. So my list can be as long as a few dozen, maybe 100 different sites. But because I have an environment variable, I can say, give me a custom value and just simply use the environment variable that is a part of my solution without having to remember which site it was. Same way with my list of library, I would just enter a custom value and choose another environment variable, this one for the library. And what this action does, which is another reason why the compose action is very helpful, you can actually specify for a list or a library, you can provide an ID for an item, and you can return the version history of that item. And if you want to determine whether or not something should be proceeding because there's been a change versus there's been no delta, you can actually specify whether you're looking for version 3 to version 12, version 1 to version 15, whatever that delta may be. And what this returns back to you is a JSON object of Boolean values. This is a value true or false change from when you specify as the beginning to the end. And I've done this logic here where I've created a compose object of an empty JSON value with all falses, assuming there's been no changes. And then I'll create a second compose action for the actual state, which is going to be returned from this action of the delta in the SharePoint version history. And it then compares those 2 objects. The object of assuming there's been no changes, so my empty is all false, and it's checking to see if any of those other values are going to be true. So that's another benefit of being able to use this compose action to compare multiple values at once instead of having to create the conditions of each value compared one at a time. And getting to the end down here, again, I can compare, just put in the JSON as an export. And you may have also noticed as I'm going through these actions that none of these are tied to my account explicitly. This is the connection reference at work. The connection references that we talked about in our solution, if we come back to the solution, these are going to be used throughout the flow. So every action that we see, every email action, every SharePoint action, if I tie into Dataverse, every connection to these external systems are going to use these connection references. That way, again, if I ever need to change the account that is being used to connect to that system, I change the account and it replicates through anything that's using the connection reference. Even if I have 15, 20 different cloud flows, we're able to use that single connection reference across all the cloud flows and just update it as necessary. It becomes an easier way of managing your credentials. But you can always have different credentials being used for different connection references depending on your systems. And I'm going to see if there's any questions in the moment, but the last piece I want to talk about is the child flow. As I mentioned, the child flow here isn't doing a lot, but I did want to show the effort of being able to centralize some type of logic. So if we come here, we have, let's say we want to use Dataverse as a table for our activity. We want to make sure that if there's an error message, if there's a success, we want to track everything that's happening inside of our cloud flow. So all we have to do from any of these flows is come into adding an action, and we're going to look for an action that calls run child flow. And I will say, if you are not doing child flows already, you can only do a child flow for a flow that's looking to receive input. So if I open this one, I'll show you how you receive and you respond to another flow calling you to do some work. And this is good for, again, centralizing that logic. Let's say I get called from a Power App. I need to create a couple of variables to do some work. And then I'm going to have some actions to write my logs to SQL Server or to Dataverse or to Salesforce. Whatever group of actions need to happen, I can group those inside my scope control. Once it's done, I respond to the flow. Always make sure you respond, because this is something else that whenever you do a call to something, there should be always a call or response. It doesn't have to be anything super flashy, but this is a good way of acknowledging to the flow, asking the work to be done, that the work was completed. And that is here. So we select one, log activity Dataverse. What I'm requesting in this one is the name of the flow, so I know which flow this is coming from. So this is coming from my Cloud Flow Advanced. I can give just a message of what happened. I can say, again, something bad happened. So we need you to log something bad happened. Really bad. So multiple exclamation marks. You can have as many calls to child flow as you would like to have. And if I jump down here, we'll see that that's essentially all my input is asking for. When you have a child flow, you can actually specify what type of input you're expecting. You can say add an input. You can request some text, yes, no, like a Boolean. Actually request a file for more complex objects. Email, number, and date. So these are your type of inputs. You're able to mix these up as well. So you don't have to use a type of each one. You could just have something simple as a text field, because all the work is going to be done here, and this is going to be referenced by everyone else. And with that, I believe, I played around with this one too much. Let me remove it. But those are largely my tips for being able to make the flows more scalable, more readable, reliable, and extensible. And let me just get back to my PowerPoint and kick this back off. So that was a demo. We come into a close for our recap. When you're building something that's scalable, you're trying to make sure that it can be used in more than one location. You're trying to build something that can actually grow beyond you. So it needs to be able to scale, and variables are a good way of doing it. In the pro code world, that's going to be our config files. In Power Automate, you can use your solution to package everything and use your environment variables and your connection references to be those placeholder variables for credentials, things that need to just be used to indicate what's happening in this particular environment or whatever it may be. When you're making things reliable, the run after condition, which is now just the error handling piece, is going to specify if something is not successful, what do we do so that the whole thing does not fail? How can we recover? So by default, it assumes it's successful. But what happens when there is a timeout, if there's a failure or something is skipped? You're able to kind of create that logic of being able to do the both of those. You also have the readability. Actually, let me take a pause there. You were able to see my screen a moment ago, but I didn't show you how you can actually add more pieces to the branching for this logic, because that is a question I got somewhere else before, and I tried to avoid forgetting to share this. But if you come to the action that needs to happen for the primary, this is going to be, again, settings. You choose what your action should be. But you'll notice there's an option here to add more actions. That's what I have done here for this piece. So you'll notice if we come into my settings, I have two conditions here. If the filter array is successful, which is this parent up here, then I want to proceed down here. However, if there is an error, I need to say if this is skipped, if it's an error message, or if something times out. And you'll see we're able to specify what's going to happen here. And so you're able to get more and more creative depending on what you need to do. So if we say even here, it keeps going. I'll give the disclaimer. I don't know what's the maximum number of actions you can do to be like this, but you can add more conditions depending on the logic as your solutions grow. What should happen if any of these things should be impacted in some capacity? So apologies for forgetting to mention that, but that is something I do think is important. As you start building more solutions, you may get into more complex scenarios where it's more than just did this or did this not fail. You may want to say, did any of these two actions fail, or did all of these actions succeed? And jumping back here. So with readability, we have the option to rename our actions to be a little bit more descriptive. We don't want it to be too verbose, but just something such as the name of the variable goes a long way of knowing what variables are being initialized, as well as when they're used later down the line for certain actions like your filters. It helps keeps the actions in order, because if we simply have filter 1, filter 2, filter 3, when we got to our JSON object and we wanted to get the length, it would have been very difficult to determine which one was which without renaming those actions. So that helps with the readability, as well as the JSON inside of the compose action being able to help us read and see what values are being compared when we're working with more complex objects. And then in closing, we talk about the idea of being extensible, being able to handle larger volumes of data, which is the piece that's very helpful with the filter array. The filter array is, I feel like it's been a game changer for me when I came across it some time ago, because I kind of cringe now when I think about my newbie flows and having to then recreate those and get these performance hits. I had one flow some years back. I think it took like an hour and a half, 2 hours to run. And then when I introduced the filter array, that 2 hour run came down to, I think, 8 minutes. So there's a huge performance boost once you start getting past your team's content. You need to be able to extend to working with thousands and thousands of records. And you don't want your flows running long, because once the flow runs long and it runs too long, and it keeps happening as more and more flows run long, you start getting resource constrained, and then you start having flows start failing. just because they can't run because they don't have enough resources. So that is going to be our recap. And my promise that we covered everything that were the main pieces for the abstract. We talked about, again, being able to scale and extend your flows by using solutions that allows you to just package everything up. With the solution, you get the child flows, you get the environment variables, connection references, and you're able to do a lot with the application lifecycle management. You're also able to add comments, use scope controls to either comprise, condense, or just move around objects with the scopes. And then you're able to kind of get things production ready for whether or not you're doing a manual deployment or if you're doing a pipeline. And pipelines can be done with GitHub or they can be done with Azure DevOps. And with that, this is my contact information. If you would like to reach out, my website's on the bottom if you want to reach out to the Two Lakes group. My LinkedIn is here, Charles Lakes II. I'm on Instagram for upcoming talks, as well as my personal GitHub as I start diving into a few more personal projects with the Power Platform, Power Apps, .NET MAUI, whatever I may be fancying that particular day. And again, middle child, the greatest of the children. And I thank everybody for sticking with me for tonight. And if you have feedback, I always look for feedback. Ed shared a QR code earlier for feedback for the user group, but I also do ask for feedback for sessions to kind of make myself a better presenter. What content should be cut, what content should be expanded upon, and so forth. So thank you all for having me.